Hollywood sold you a lie about coal mining. The image burned into your brain is probably a dozen grizzled miners hunched over with pickaxes, while some whiskered foreman barks orders about ventilation shafts and gas readings. The safety inspector with his clipboard and his regulations. The union man negotiating for better conditions. Here's what the archives show instead. Between 1900 and 1909, 3,060 American miners died underground in over 100 separate disasters. That's one man every 23 hours. Not from cave-ins, not from falling rock. From invisible poison that had no smell, no color, no warning. Carbon monoxide built up in those shafts at 0.25% concentration, and you had maybe 40 minutes before your brain shut down for good. The safety inspectors couldn't detect it. The foreman couldn't smell it. The union contracts couldn't negotiate with physics. But a 3-ounce bird with a heart rate of 1,000 beats per minute could sense it 90 seconds after exposure and collapse within 5 minutes, giving every man in that tunnel time to run for daylight. The Canaries saved more lives than every safety regulation written between 1900 and 1930 combined, and it cost mining companies about $2 per bird, about $60 today, versus the $2,000 they'd pay out after 1908 when a miner's family sued for wrongful death. This is the story of how American industry discovered that the cheapest life-saving technology ever invented wasn't invented by engineers. Let us look at the physical reality of a drift in the Winter Quarters mine. Schofield, Utah, shortly before the turn of the century. It is 7 a.m. The elevation is high. The air outside is thin, and inside it is non-existent. The temperature is a constant, damp 55 degrees. The tunnel is 6 feet high and supported by Douglas fir timbers that are already groaning under the weight of 1,000 feet of sandstone overburden. The only light comes from the open flame of lard oil lamps or candles hooked into soft caps. This is the first point of failure. Open flame in a coal mine is a ballistic risk, but electric lamps are heavy, expensive, and unreliable in 1890. The air smells of unwashed bodies, rotting timber, sulfur, and the acrid, lingering scent of black powder blasting charges. A miner named Miller is checking a stopping area. He is carrying a small cage, roughly 6 inches by 6 inches, made of wire mesh and wood. Inside is a male canary. The females were cheaper, but the males sang, and the silence was the first indicator of a problem. Miller isn't looking at the bird with affection. He's watching the bottom of the cage. The bird is hopping. Its heart is beating at roughly 1,000 beats per minute. It is processing oxygen at a rate that burns through its blood supply with a ferocity human biology cannot match. Miller is paid by the ton. He earns about $3 a day, roughly $110 in modern purchasing power. It is a decent wage for unskilled labor, but it comes with a catch. Dead work is unpaid. Shoring up timbers, clearing debris, or checking for gas is dead work. It stops the production of coal. Therefore, Miller has a financial incentive to ignore safety. The bird does not have a financial incentive. The bird is the only honest thing in the tunnel. To understand why the bird was necessary, you have to look at the economics of the Western territories. The narrative of the Wild West is usually gunfights and cattle drives. The reality was industrial extraction. By 1890, the surface gold was gone. The money was underground. Copper in Butte, silver in the Comstock, coal in Utah and Colorado to feed the railroads. This required deep shaft mining. As you go deeper, ventilation becomes an engineering nightmare. You're trying to push fresh air down a 2,000-foot straw and suck bad air out of another. It requires massive fans, intricate systems of doors and brattices to direct airflow. But mine owners were capitalists, not humanitarians. Fans cost money. Coal to run the steam engines for the fans costs money. If they could turn the fans down to half speed to save fuel, they did. The result was a cocktail of lethal gases. The miners had names for them, simplified for quick communication. Fire damp was methane. It was lighter than air, gathered in the roof of the tunnel, and was explosive. If you walked into a pocket of fire damp with an open candle, the flame would elongate, turn blue, and then the air would ignite. White damp was carbon monoxide. This was the killer. It is a byproduct of incomplete combustion, blasting powder that didn't burn clean, or a mine fire smoldering in a sealed-off section. It is odorless, colorless, and tasteless. It bonds to the hemoglobin in your blood 200 times more effectively than oxygen. You can breathe it in and feel fine. You don't choke, you just get a little tired. Your legs get heavy. Then you sit down to rest, and you never stand up again. Before the Canary, the detection methods were primitive and often fatal. The fire boss would go in before the shift. He would wear a heavy wet coat and crawl along the floor where the air was better. He would raise a safety lamp on a pole into the roof crevices. If the flame got longer, there was methane. If the flame went out, there was black damp, carbon dioxide. If the flame stayed lit but the fire boss didn't come back, there was white damp. It was a binary system, safe or dead. The mortality rate reflected this. In the western coal fields, the death rate was roughly 5 men per 1,000 per year. In a town of 2,000 miners, 10 would die every year as a statistical certainty. That is not an accident, that is an operating cost. Enter John Scott Haldane. He was a Scottish physiologist, a man who didn't mind poisoning himself for data. He identified that the central problem with carbon monoxide was the delay. A man acts as a large buffer. It takes time to saturate 5 liters of human blood with carbon monoxide. A man could walk into a pocket of gas, work for 20 minutes, and collapse. By the time his partner noticed, the partner was already saturated too. Haldane needed a smaller buffer. He needed a metabolism that ran hot. He looked at mice. He looked at guinea pigs, but he settled on the canary. The physiology is the mechanism of salvation here. Birds have a continuous flow respiratory system. They do not have a diaphragm like mammals. Air moves through them in a single direction, maximizing oxygen extraction. This makes them incredibly efficient, but also incredibly vulnerable to airborne toxins. A canary will show signs of distress, swaying, ruffling feathers, ceasing to sing, at carbon monoxide concentrations of 0.05%. At that concentration, a human might get a mild headache after an hour. At 0.1%, the bird falls off the perch in 3 minutes. A human would collapse in 20. That 17-minute gap is the difference between a story told at the saloon and a funeral paid for by the county. The adoption of the canary in the western mines wasn't immediate. Miners are creatures of habit, and they are skeptical of university men telling them to carry bird cages. It looked ridiculous, it looked soft, but the data broke the resistance. The first time a crew watched a bird drop stone dead in a drift that looked and smelled perfectly safe, and then felt the headache set in. Moments later, as they scrambled back to the main shaft, the skepticism evaporated. The bird became the most valuable tool in the kit. Let's examine the specific equipment. This wasn't a decorative item from a Victorian parlor. The mining cages were built for abuse. Heavy gauge wire, reinforced corners. Later models, specifically the ones introduced after the turn of the century by companies like Sieb Gorman, were engineering marvels. They were airtight boxes with a glass front and a wire mesh door. The door would be open during normal operation. If the bird showed distress, the miner would slam the door shut, sealing the bird inside. Then, he would open a valve on a small attached tank of oxygen. This was the resuscitator. The oxygen would flood the sealed cage, reviving the bird while the miners evacuated. This wasn't out of kindness. It was logistics. A trained bird that was used to the noise and darkness of the mine was an asset. You didn't want to buy a new one every time you hit a pocket of bad air. Plus, a dead bird can't warn you about the next pocket of gas 10 feet further down. Reusing the sensor was economically sound. The cost-benefit analysis is stark. A canary cost $2. A miner's life was valued by the courts, when they bothered to value it at all, at roughly $2,000 or $75,000 today. But the real cost was the shutdown. If a crew died, the mine shut down for investigation and body recovery. That could take a week. A mine producing 500 tons coal a day, selling at $2.50 a ton, stood to lose nearly $10,000 in revenue, almost $400,000 in modern currency, from a single fatal gas event. The Canary was an insurance policy with a premium of birdseed. However, systems fail. The friction point in this mechanism was always the human element. On May 1, 1900, at the Winter Quarters mine in Schofield, Utah, the system failed catastrophically. It remains one of the worst mining disasters in American history. The context is crucial. Schofield was a boom town. The Pleasant Valley Coal Company was pushing for record output. They had huge contracts with the Rio Grande Western Railroad. The dust in the mine was dry. Coal dust is as explosive as gunpowder if it's suspended in the air at the right ratio. There were reports of gas. The fire bosses knew there were issues, but the pressure to produce was absolute. At 10:25 a.m., a keg of black powder exploded. This is a common occurrence. Usually it just burns a few men. But this explosion kicked up the dust. The shock wave traveled through the tunnels at the speed of sound, lifting the coal dust from the floor and walls, mixing it with the air and igniting it in a chain reaction that tore through the No. 4 mine and jumped to the No. 1 mine. The explosion killed some men instantly. The concussion turned their internal organs to jelly. But the explosion wasn't the mass killer. The killer was the afterdamp. When a coal dust explosion consumes all the oxygen in the tunnel, the byproduct is massive amounts of carbon monoxide. White damp. Men in the No. 1 mine heard the thud. They didn't feel the heat. They thought it was just a heavy blast in another section. They kept working. They didn't have canaries in every drift. It wasn't mandated by law yet. They had safety lamps, but remember, safety lamps detect methane and carbon dioxide. They do not detect carbon monoxide. The lamps burned bright and clear. The men assumed the air was good. This is the horror of sensory deprivation. They started to walk toward the exit, not in a panic, but just to see what happened. One by one, they sat down. The layout of the bodies found later tells the forensic story. They weren't piled up at a blocked door. They were spaced out along the haulage ways. Father and son found sitting next to each other, lunch pails open as if they had just decided to take a break. They didn't choke. They just went to sleep. If they had a canary, the bird would have been dead on the floor of the cage before they even stood up to investigate. They would have known to barricade themselves in a side room and seal the cracks with canvas and mud to wait for rescue. Without the biological sensor, they were flying blind. 200 men died. The official number is usually cited as 200, but the reality of the era suggests it was higher. Migrant workers, often operating under assumed names or off the books to bypass union. Quotas weren't always on the ledger. The recovery effort lasted for weeks. And who led the recovery teams? Men carrying cages. The rescuers would advance 50 feet, set the cage down, watch the bird. If the bird stayed upright, they advanced another 50 feet. If the bird wobbled, they retreated. It was a slow, methodical push into the tomb. The sensory details of the recovery are gruesome. The smell of the afterdamp is described as sweet, almost floral. Beneath that, the smell of burnt coal and decomposition. The rescuers wrapped wet rags around their faces, which did absolutely nothing against carbon monoxide. They relied entirely on the metabolic rate of the bird. The financial fallout of Schofield was massive, but not for the reasons you might think. The company paid out settlements, but they were pitiful. A widow might receive $500, about $18,000 today. The real cost was the destruction of the mine infrastructure and the loss of labor. It took months to get the mine back to full capacity. This economic hit, more than the human tragedy, drove the widespread adoption of stricter gas detection protocols. The Canary moved from a good idea to standard operating procedure. By 1911, the U.S. Bureau of Mines began to standardize the use of canaries. They issued guidelines on how to care for them. You do not feed a mine canary treats. You keep its diet strict so its metabolism remains consistent. You rotate the birds. A bird that has been gassed once becomes more sensitive, but also more prone to false positives, fainting from stress rather than gas. A stress faint looks exactly like a gas faint, and it clears the mine just as fast. A false alarm costs money. So, veterans' birds were retired or moved to less critical duties. The legacy of this practice is written in the graveyards of mining towns from Butte to Bisbee. You see the headstones of men who died young, aged 25 or 30. Killed in the mine. But look at the dates. After the widespread introduction of the canary and the safety lamp, the mass casualty events from suffocation drop statistically. The single deaths, rock falls, equipment accidents remained high, but the silent reaping of entire shifts by white damp decreased. There is a pervasive myth that the miners had a sentimental attachment to these birds. You will find poems and folk songs about the miner's little friend. Do not confuse propaganda with reality. Did some miners grow fond of them? Sure, isolation breeds strange attachments. But fundamentally, the relationship was utilitarian. A miner checked his pickaxe for cracks, he checked his lamp for oil, and he checked his bird for life. If the bird died, he didn't hold a funeral. He ran. The transition away from canaries didn't happen because of animal rights activists. It happened because of electronics. By the mid-20th century, the electrochemical sensor was developed. It could detect carbon monoxide at parts per million. It was rugged, it didn't need birdseed, and it didn't die. But even then, the transition was slow. An electronic sensor requires calibration, it requires batteries, it can drift. A canary is self-calibrating, it is either alive or it is not. There is no error code on a dead bird. In the United Kingdom, they kept canaries in the regulations until 1986. Think about that. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded the same year the British finally decided that a microchip was more reliable than a bird. In the American West, the practice faded out earlier, in the 1940s and 50s, as the big industrial mines mechanized and ventilation technology improved. But for 50 years, the difference between life and death in the most dangerous job in America was a 3-ounce ball of yellow feathers. The forensic data is clear. We cannot know the exact number of times a bird fell off a perch and a crew turned around and walked out. Those non-events don't make the newspapers. They don't create widows. They just create another day of production. But if you look at the volume of birds purchased versus the decline in gas asphyxiation deaths, the correlation is undeniable. 50,000 birds is a conservative estimate for the Western Territories over half a century. If even 1% of those birds signaled a retreat that saved a crew of 5 men, you are looking at 2,500 men who went home to their families instead of the undertaker. The economic value of those lives, in terms of wages earned and coal produced, runs into the millions of dollars of the era, hundreds of millions today. The canary was the most cost-effective safety device in the history of industrial engineering. It required no electricity, no maintenance other than water and seed, and it had a failure rate of 0. It never failed to die when the air turned bad. When you walk through the ruins of the old mining camps today, places like Bodie, California, or the ghost towns of the San Juan Mountains, you see the rusted hulks of the stamp mills. You see the rotting head frames. You see the massive iron boilers hauled up on mules at a cost of thousands. But you won't see the cages. They were wood and wire. They rotted away. But in the forensic accounting of the Wild West, the heavy iron killed men and the fragile wood saved them. The modern equivalent of the canary is the digital gas monitor clipped to a worker's lapel. It beeps, it flashes, it logs data to a cloud server. It costs $600, roughly $16,000 in 1890 money. It is a marvel of technology. But in the deep drifts of 1899, with a budget of 0 and a life expectancy of 40, the solution wasn't silicon. It was biology. The miners didn't need a readout. They needed a binary signal. Song means life. Silence means death. Consider the incident at the Sunnyside mine in Utah years later. A fire broke out. The ventilation fans were pushing the smoke into the working areas. The men were miles from the surface. The phone lines burned through. The only warning they had was the smell. By the time you smell wood smoke in a coal mine, you're usually already in trouble. But the crews that had birds saw them drop before the smoke even became visible. Carbon monoxide moves faster than heavy smoke particles. Those crews evacuated immediately. The crews that waited for the smell, the sensory confirmation they were used to, found themselves fighting through air that was already toxic. Many didn't make it. The birds bought the lead time. In a disaster, time is the only currency that matters. It is also worth noting the specific gases involved in hard rock mining versus coal. While coal mines had the explosive methane, the gold and silver mines of Nevada and Colorado had their own atmospheric horrors. Blasting in dead-end drifts produced nitrogen dioxide, red fume. This causes pulmonary edema. You drown in your own fluids, but it takes hours. The canary would react to the irritation immediately. Miners in the Comstock lode faced heat that could boil a man alive, but the gases were the insidious threat. The canary struggled in the heat, panting to cool down, which actually made it sample the air even faster. It became hypersensitive in the exact conditions where the men were most fatigued and least likely to notice a change in their own physiology. The supply chain for these birds was its own microeconomy. Pet stores in San Francisco and Denver did a brisk trade, but the mining companies eventually started breeding their own or buying in bulk from breeders in the Midwest. A shipment of 500 birds to a mine in Montana was a standard logistics order listed right next to blasting caps and shovel handles. The invoice would read, 50 kegs powder, 100 FT fuse, 2 dose shovels, 10 canaries. That is the reality of the West. Life was a line item. There is a story, likely apocryphal but grounded in the mechanics of the time, of a miner in Leadville who refused to evacuate when his bird died. He claimed the bird was just old. He claimed he felt fine. He kept drilling. His partner, a younger man, respected the hierarchy and stayed with him. The shift boss found them 4 hours later. The drill was still running, jamming against the rock face because the air pressure was still on. The men were slumped over the machine. The bird was on the floor of the cage. The autopsy, if you can call a cursory glance by a company doctor an autopsy, listed heart failure. It kept the safety record clean. But the bird knew. The bird always knew. The legacy of the canary is not in the museums. It is in the safety protocols we take for granted. The concept of the sentinel species comes from this era. We use mussels to test water quality. We use bees to test air quality around cities. But it started in the dark, with a $2 bird and a man trying to feed his family. The final calculation is this. The Wild West was tamed not by the Colt revolver, but by the steam engine and the dynamite stick. It was an industrial conquest, and like all industrial conquests, it demanded blood. The canary didn't stop the bloodletting, but it stemmed the flow. It provided the one thing the frontier rarely offered, a warning. In a world defined by sudden violence, a rockfall, a stray bullet, a boiler explosion, the canary offered a moment of grace. A few minutes to drop the tools, grab the lamp, and run toward the light. For 50,000 birds, The price was their life. For the miners, the price was $2. In the cold calculus of the 19th century, that was a trade every mine owner was willing to make.